Hello and welcome back to In the Booth. Happy New Year, happy new series. I hope you all had a very restful, festive season. I truly love this time of year. I think it is one of the most magical times of year. I mean, the whole lead up to Christmas is so exciting. And then you have Christmas Day, which can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes. I think it's just like any day, like Halloween or your birthday, where there's just expectation on it. But then you get to Boxing Day and then you don't have to move until New Year's, which is really amazing. And I definitely didn't move. I think there was one day where I watched like 4 films in a day. I got back into YouTube. Well, I say got back into YouTube. I don't think I've never really understood YouTube. I wasn't a YouTube watcher, but I've discovered YouTube, I guess, over this Christmas break. And now In the Booth is on YouTube. So hopefully you're watching this on YouTube and then you can put a face to the voice. Hello, I'm Amira. And yeah, I also love making New Year's resolutions. I think it's so fun doing like journaling about how the last year has gone and then what you want to do in the next year. And for 2026, one of my favorite New Year's resolutions is to take more lessons. I think because I'm not at uni and a lot of my friends are at uni, and I'm obviously learning because I have a job and I'm learning through the job, but I do really miss like formal learning, and so I want to take some Spanish lessons. I want to take some horse riding lessons, not now because it is so cold right now. I think that's going to be a summer thing. I also don't know where I'm going to find a horse because I live in London, but hopefully by the time summer comes around, I will have found a horse because I do one day want to go to Argentina. And when I go to Argentina, I want to do some horse riding. But I've never done horse riding before. So I figured I should probably have a bit of an understanding before I jump on an Argentinian horse and have no idea what I'm doing. So I want to take horse riding lessons. I also, over the Christmas break, I was doing some composing and just for fun. And it was actually really fun. But I struggle with composing beats, which is strange because I love hip hop and rap music. So you'd think I kind of know about beats, and I know that's a problem. Like I know what I want in my brain. I just really don't know how to translate that through Logic electronic drum machines. And so that is one of my New Year's resolutions, is to learn the drums, because I also think it's just so cool to be able to say that you learn the drums. And it's so important. Like every continent has their own drum, which is really cool. So those are some of my New Year's resolutions. And this kind of brings me on to the topic of the episode. Don't worry, there was an ending to that tangent, which is another one of my New Year's resolutions, is to be more punk in 2026. But really, I'm not very punk and I want to be more punk because I really think that's what the world needs and that's what I need in 2026. And so, this is the topic of the episode. I am going to try and convince you, or if not convince you, just share my ideas on why 2026 should be the year of punk. And so you're probably wondering, Amira, why is 2026 going to be the year of punk? Well, for me personally, I want to be more bold. I want to be more confrontational, not in an argumentative way, like not confronting others, but more, I guess, this is going to sound so cheesy, but like confronting myself and what I believe in and trying to understand where my beliefs come from, because I think a lot of the thoughts that I have, I don't know whether they are mine or if they're what I've been told to think. And so I want to confront that and basically just unpick my brain from the mainstream and try to get back to being more individual and more me. And I think I do that anyway. I don't think I pretend to be anything I'm not. Well, I definitely don't pretend to be anything I'm not. But I want to just be more me. And I think by adopting punk ethos, that is how I'm going to do it. And so that's why for me, I want 2026 to be the year of punk. And throughout this episode, I am going to be talking about why I think the world as a whole should be more punk. And I think to do that, I should lay the foundation for my argument. I will try to give you a brief history of punk. I really enjoyed researching this. I've watched so many YouTube videos about punk, about Vivienne Westwood. Obviously, I couldn't get through an episode about punk without mentioning Vivienne Westwood, even though she is a fashion designer and not a musician, but she was hugely influential and really inspiring to me. I mean, I saw this one YouTube video of her with her pixie cut when she was a lot younger, and it was incredibly cool. And I really wanted a pixie cut because I think when I shaved my hair off a few years ago, and I think when I shaved it off, I didn't truly embrace all that a buzz cut meant. Like I shaved it off and it made me not really care about how my hair looks and not really care much about how I look, which I think was good because I think at that point like I was very self-conscious and it made me not very self-conscious. But I think if I was to do it today, I would embrace the growing out stages a lot more. I mean, there were some terrible growing out stages. Like I can't explain to you how awful my hair looks in some pictures. But I would have embraced that a little bit more and probably tried to do a little bit more, experiment more with that. Like I think I should have bleached it, but I didn't. And so anyways, when I was watching this YouTube video at like midnight the other night, because I went down a big YouTube rabbit hole, I was very close to shaving my hair, but I didn't. But maybe at the end of this episode, that can be my celebration that I finally got through recording this first episode and I can shave it off. I don't know. You'll have to see in the next episode if I am bald. But putting buzz cuts aside for a second, I want to take you back to 1575 because that's when the word punk was first recorded, which is crazy. 1575. I mean, Shakespeare used the word punk in 2 of his plays, which I honestly think is the coolest thing ever. But it was in 1899 when punk was first used to describe music. And now the use of the phrase 1899 punk refers to everything that predated 1970s punk. And it usually refers to amateurish or rebellious music. And that's how it was used in 1899. Someone described a song as the most punk song ever heard in a hall, which was in San Francisco, which is really cool, I think, that someone described something as punk in 1899. But 1970 is when the phrase punk rock was first used. And that's really what I'll be talking about in this episode and its evolution and why it started, because it really has strong roots with working class Britain. In the 1970s, there was mass closure across industries, mass youth unemployment, and youth took to music to express their discontent and anger at the system and betrayal of the government through punk music. And obviously, if we're talking about 1970s UK punk, I'm going to mention the Sex Pistols now because they were one of the most influential bands of all time. They completely contrasted the polished aesthetic of music at the time and blew that all out of the water and inspired bands who weren't even punk. I mean, they played this, here's a fun fact, they played this gig in 1976, I think it was, in Manchester. And there was one of the members of Joy Division and one of the members of the Smiths in the crowd. And one of the members of Joy Division went out and bought I think it was a guitar, I think it was the guitarist, the next day after that gig, which is insane because then in 1979 Joy Division released their first album. And it was more than just music. They influenced fashion, art, the media, politics. I mean, the Sex Pistols really are just one of the greatest bands of all time. And actually, here's another fun fact, which I found out while watching my Vivienne Westwood YouTube video. She started as a fashion designer because she was a teacher and she started making clothes for her boyfriend, who was the manager of the Sex Pistols, which I had no idea about. I mean, I obviously thought there had to be some connection between them, but I really didn't know that that connection was that she was making their clothes, which I probably should have thought, but I didn't. And so there's another fun fact for you. And obviously, Sex Pistols weren't the only band to be punk. There was this band called MC5 who predated punk. They were releasing like 1969, 1970s, and they were releasing incredibly political music. And one of the themes that they would write about was police brutality, which is not a topic that I really associated with punk. I definitely associated that more with hip hop because of NWA's famous F the Police song. And I think and it made me think about the similarities between punk and hip hop because both genres are so incredibly political. Their entire roots are political, yet they produce political music in such drastically different ways. And I think what makes punk different to hip hop, not just the instrumentation, but in terms of the themes, is punk is a lot more emotionally vulnerable and authentic than I would say hip hop is. I think because punk is not about the fame or the money, whereas hip hop definitely has themes of aspiration and wanting to make it basically, which punk does not and completely rejects. And that's not to say that hip hop isn't authentic, because I love hip hop and I love rap, and that is my favorite genre, and it's one of my favorite genres because I think it is authentic. But punk is authentic in a different way because it's not trying to move on from where it is. And I think that's what makes punk so unique. I think that's what makes punk so unique and so refreshing, because it isn't about money. It is about activism, essentially. It's anti-establishment, it's anti, in the UK, anti the Queen, anti-corporation, anti the mainstream. And this brings me on to my first point in my argument that 2026 should be punk, because I think in the age of AI that we're currently in, where you don't know whether what you're reading was written by AI or what you're watching was generated by AI. I mean, you kind of can tell, but you're not going to be able to tell for very long. Like, AI is only going to get better, and that's quite scary. And it's quite scary as a creative person, because creativity is so human and is so individual and personal and unique. And so I think in 2026, we're already craving more authenticity from the content that we consume or the things that we read online, the people that we look up to in the media. And I think in 2026, that's only going to increase. And punk at its core is completely authentic. And that really inspires me, because I can't really think of many other things right now that are completely authentic. And it makes me want to be more authentic, and more authentic in how I present myself to the world, I think, especially online, on social media. Everything is a highlight reel, nothing is actually real. And that's quite sad and very disheartening. And punk answers that in quite energizing, motivating way. And I think the whole idea of punk being amateurish and DIY is really going to be something that people crave in 2026 with AI, because you don't want things to be polished anymore, because that could mean it was created by AI, and you don't want things to be perfect, and you don't want to see someone pretending that things are perfect, because they're not. We all know that they're not. And it's refreshing to see content online that isn't completely perfect, basically. And I hope we see that DIY attitude not just in music but also in fashion again, because punk fashion is completely DIY. And this actually brings us very nicely onto the 1980s, because this is where the punk community really began to be established and joined together. and the subgenre flourished essentially. And it flourished because punk started to infiltrate media with zines, and it infiltrated fashion. I mean, Vivienne Westwood used to describe dressing punk as dressing like an urban gorilla. It is sexually provocative, it is DIY, it is grimy, it is chains and safety pins. And the sense of community really emerges because it was so different to the mainstream. It was a subculture, it was its own living, breathing identity. And people were free to express themselves how they wanted. They were encouraged to express themselves how they wanted. They didn't need to fit into the mainstream box, and they could express themselves with others, you know? And I think that's something really special about subcultures. And I think that is something that we have lost with social media, is that now you don't have to completely commit to a subculture. And that is good in itself. You know, people can have different interests and engage in different communities, yes. But to participate in a subculture pre social media, there was a sense of abandonment, a sense of fearlessness, of boldness, of rejection. You know, you were rejecting the mainstream and choosing to find your own community, and you then had to go and join that community. You couldn't sit in your room and have half a foot in the door of that community. You had to go to events, you had to go to gigs, you had to go to protests. And now with social media, you don't have to do that. And I think, especially post COVID, youth don't know how to do that. That's not to say they don't know how to interact with people, but I think partly we don't really know how to interact with people because we were interacting with floating heads on Zoom for such a key part of our lives and a major stage of our development. We didn't have that exposure to other humans. But that for me is one of the reasons why I think punk should come back. It's so different and it's so unique. That sense of community is just so strong. And I think now the world really needs community, and it needs connection, and it needs collaboration, and that is in person. But we just don't know how to do that really anymore. And maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. I think it might be. But I'm going to leave that exaggeration there, and I'm going to move on to the 90s, because this, interestingly, is where punk came into the mainstream. Nirvana brought it into the mainstream, and Green Day established pop punk. And this moves on into the 2000s. And with it comes a little bit of criticism, and I guess a divide in the punk community, because a lot of people didn't agree with pop punk. They said it was too soft. They would say it talked about love too much, which, anyways, I think is a little bit ridiculous. But it was more that pop punk was having such material success, and that directly contrasts with the ethos of punk, and that caused a divide. And I think it's interesting to think about that for a moment, because punk is so gated. It feels as though, like, not being a punk rocker myself, but enjoying punk rock music, saying that I like punk rock music feels like opening myself up to a lot of criticism. And that's because I think the punk rock community can sometimes be quite gated and quite strict in their beliefs and what they think is punk. But as with every genre, when subgenres develop and that genre as a whole moves forward and moves on with culture and technology, I think it's difficult to put strict rules around their evolution. And I think those rules contrast directly with the ethos of punk, which is basically anti rules. It is, don't feel the need to box yourself in, but do what you want. And I think it's quite ironic then that the rules that punk tries to fight gets enforced upon itself. You know, punk has to be political, and it has to be this, and it has to be that, and you can't write that many love songs. Well, those rules go against punk. That's not punk if you're adding rules to something. Actually, that person who then says, I don't want your rules, I want to make pop punk and I want to write about love and I want to make punk a little bit softer because that's who I am. Well, that's so punk. That's so punk. That's kind of what I mean when I say that 2026 should be the year of the punk. Is I don't think that everyone should be walking around dressed like a punk rocker because that isn't everyone. That's not me. But I think it's about adapting punk to suit who you are and suit what you want. And I think I'm going to leave that there because I want to talk about 2004 because that was a massive year for punk rock. Um, as I just had the debate with myself about can punk be adaptable, I mean, that was a debate going on in the punk community. And I think it did cause some divide, as all debates do. It can be quite polarizing. But in 2004, Green Day released American Idiot, which is one of the best punk rock albums of all time, if not one of the best albums of all time. And I highly recommend that you go listen to that after this episode because it is incredible. And if you actually, another recommendation, if you don't want to listen to that, there was another album that was released in 2009, which is again a major punk rock album. And interestingly, it is Death's first album, but was recorded in 1975 and only released in 2009 because there was issues with the record label and the fact that the band's name was Death. And that basically meant that the music wasn't put out into the world for 30 years, which is a real shame because that album is also incredible. And so I highly recommend you either listen to American Idiot or you listen to that album afterwards. But more on 2004, not only did Green Day release their iconic album, but another album was released which kind of brought together the punk rock community and more generally the rock community because it was called Rock Against Bush and it was a collaborative album. Loads of bands played on it and it opposed the re-election of President Bush. They collaborated as well with an organization called Punk Voter, which aimed to encourage youth to vote during the election. And this brings me on to my final point about why 2026 should be the year of the punk and hopefully ties the episode together because punk is political. It has been political since the 1970s and it is political now. And it confronts politics. It doesn't aim to be a political solution, but it is an outlet for youth to express their discontent with politics. And I think, especially now in the world that we're in, politics can be a really confusing, a really scary place, and very disheartening, especially for youth. And I think having creative outlets, whether that be punk or art or music, is really important. But we don't necessarily turn to those creative outlets anymore because we have digital tools and distractions everywhere we turn that you kind of forget to process your emotions and express your emotions in that way. And I think that's a shame. But I do think that punk would bring that back more than any other subgenre because it overtakes so much. It overtakes music and art and fashion and media and attitude and ethos and the values of a community. And that's why I would love if in 2026 the world was more punk. I would think it would be a much more inspiring and motivating place as a young person. And it would also just be so cool if we were in another era of punk. But I do think it's interesting because punk is so anti-corporation, and obviously in 2026 corporations are everywhere. You can't live your life without interacting with corporations. It brings me back to my point that punk should evolve and be adapted to the world that we're in right now. And so if you don't want to shave your head and if you don't want to wear safety pins, then that's okay and that's cool, and you can still be punk without having to be the whole of punk, I think. And so I want to wrap up there because we've gone all the way from 1585 to 2026 following punk and its evolution. And hopefully in 2026 it evolves even more and more people begin to resonate with it and embody punk. But I do want to mention before I sign off for this episode that if you do want to watch any of the YouTube videos or learn a little bit more about punk, then I am releasing an article on my Substack about punk. And the Substack is called Just Outside the Booth, which I now have to give a shout out to my friends Lucy and Dylan, who, when I first released series one, started up a spin-off podcast called Just Outside the Booth, where they would rate my song of the day. And so I've named the Substack in honor of them because that really encouraged me all throughout series one. This whole podcast could be quite nerve-wracking sometimes, and it was really special. And so the Substack Just Outside the Booth is the footnotes that accompany in the booth. So the research that I did, you can also find the Spotify playlist to go with each episode there from all the songs and bands that I mentioned throughout the episodes, and also a few of the rabbit holes that I don't actually include in the final cut of the episode, and a few more of my hot takes. So if that is of any interest to you, then you can go and check it out, and I would very much appreciate that. And that leaves me with nothing more to say other than I hope you have a very punk 2026, and hopefully by the end of 2026 I will be more punk than this poor little brooch. But you know, it's a first step, and baby steps always lead into bigger steps. So I hope you make a few punk baby steps if you want to. Okay, I will see you in the next episode. Bye bye.